have got to that point that we forget that there are times that we should be celebrating. We celebrate all kinds of things. What do we celebrate? Name a few. Huh? Christmas. Birthdays. Valentine's Day. Anniversaries. Pardon? New Year's. Okay. Retirement. Thanksgiving. July 4th. Labor Days. Boy, we've got a lot of celebrations, don't we, in this nation we live in. And we enjoy celebrating. And so often we sometimes get in sort of a mindset that it's like, oh yeah, got to do that. It's like changing our clocks last week. Oh yeah, we've got to do that. We've got to lose an hour's time. How many of you celebrated? Not likely. You probably suffered a little all week for the time change. But then there are times that we need to celebrate. There are times that we need to be reminded that not everything is going to be a time of sadness or sorrow. You think about God's people in the Old Testament. God started out on a great note. In the beginning, what? God created. And He created the earth, and He created all of these things on the earth, and He created man so that they could have fellowship with Him and celebrate and walk together. And then man goes and what? Sins. And he blows it. How many of you have ever blown it? Had an issue in life along the way? We have all failed. It tells us in the New Testament, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But God is faithful to us. You know, God likes to celebrate, and we keep forgetting, and sometimes we get in the down cycle. And so often we need to realize that there are cycles. We, in the study of life in exile, have seen some of the cycles that God's people have taken. There seems to be this cycle that we go from joy to sorrow. And then we go back to joy again. And then something happens and we sort of slip back into the sorrow pattern. And then something happens and we come back. In all the stories that we've looked at in exile, there are so many of those that seem to go that direction. What were some of the major stories you remember us talking about in some of the exile? What were some, just name one. Esther. Yeah, Esther was used dramatically to help her people that went from a time of sorrow and sadness to a time of celebration because they had life and hope and brought back to joy. What other story? Moses. Okay, Moses was back there in that, yeah, of walking away and people coming back. How many of you remember some of the stories in Daniel? You know, people in exile, they were in a bad spot. They had come to that point in their lives and they were trusting God, and all of a sudden it looked like they were done for. And yet God brings them back in celebration, in joy. And we get into the book of Nehemiah, and there is truly a cycle that happens there. You think about at the beginning of Nehemiah, Nehemiah is serving a king. He is the cupbearer. He is right at the king's side. He has influence with the king. The only bad part about his job is if somebody tries to poison the king, he gets it first. Other than that, it's a great job. And he has influence with the king. And a report came back to him that took him from a sense of joy in his life to sadness, because the report came back about the wall around Jerusalem. Some of the inhabitants had gone back under Zerubbabel, and the temple was rebuilt. And Ezra had taken another group of people, and he had come back. And so Nehemiah prays, and if you remember right, we said, how long was it before he approached the king? Yeah, 3 months, 4 months before he finally approached the king and asked him, if he could take and go back and rebuild the wall. And you're thinking, man, that sounds pretty sad, doesn't it? People are in distress. It's not looking good. Do you think I can go back? And the king says, well, of course you can go back. And here, I'm going to send this with you. And I'm going to send some soldiers with you. And I'm going to give you a bill of sale that says paid in full. You give it to the lumbermen out here in the Cedars of Lebanon area. And they will cut lumber for you. And they will provide these things for you. And all of a sudden, there's that sense of possible joy back in his life. And then it tells us that Nehemiah went back and he spent 3 days before he did anything. And then he went out around the city. Boy, that was a downer. Have you ever gone out to check something out? You already know it's bad. And then you're checking it out and you're going, oh man, it's like your car going bad. You're thinking, well, it's not too bad. And then the mechanic gets back to you and it's be like Nehemiah walking around the city looking, and he's looking at these towers and these gates, and he's going, man, there's another one. They burnt the gate out of it. Oh, no. Walks to another one. Oh, no. They burnt another one. After a while, he's circling in the dark, and he can't even get through on his horse, and it's like, oh, my. But that would be our attitude. Nehemiah came back out of that and he talked to the people and he had been praying, and he gets to that point and they come to the point and it's like, yes, let's rebuild the wall. And they go out to rebuild the wall, and people were set up in different places, each one participating, helping out along the way. And there's great joy. And then all of a sudden there's spoilers in this, isn't there? There were 3 men that represented basically 3 nationalities that hated the Jewish people. And they caused them trouble. Have you ever been just about to the point you're getting excited and all of a sudden somebody walks back in your life and you're going, oh no, not them. And here it was. These ones were against him. They wanted to take and destroy them. They were going to take and tear down what they were working on. And so Nehemiah says, okay, let's pray to God. We're going to take and still keep building. And so one of the guys got to build and one of the guys got to stand guard. Some of them got to hold their spear in one hand and their trowel in the other hand, or their stone cutting tool in the other hand, and they kept building. And finally this wall comes together. How is it that when you get some project to that point or something in your life, all of a sudden you come together and it's time to celebrate? We were feeling sad this morning because one of our granddaughters had told us just this week that she was going to get baptized. And we're like, oh, everybody I can think of that was available to speak for me in a last minute notice, because she actually yesterday says, I'm going to get baptized. And it's like, and you're invited. It's like, oh. And we're going, oh. And our son-in-law kiddingly said, as we were at their house yesterday, he looks at Ginger and he says to her, you don't look good. Maybe you're sick and you shouldn't go to Monroe. And it's like, but we're looking and we're going, no, that can't work because we've got certain things that we've got to get and it's not there. And you just, it's like, oh no. And then the sad part, but the joyous part in a sense, was that she ended up being sick this morning and wasn't going to be able to do it. So it's like, and you're thinking, aren't sorrow and joy intermixed, it sounds like, in life? And so we know, hey, guess what? There will still be a time to celebrate. And when we know that time, we're going to go celebrate with her. We won't be here on that Sunday. We're going to figure it out so we can go there and be part of that. And you're thinking about these ones, they had finally got together. In chapter 12, it tells us, in chapter 11 and 12 of Nehemiah, it tells us that all these ones had come together. Different ones were living inside and outside of the city. They drew lots to see what ones, it said like 1 out of 10, would go and live in the city to help be part of it, different ones that were there. So it's like, hey, isn't this great? It's starting to come together. They had overcome their enemies. They had built this wall. It was a strong wall, and they had come together, Levites, priests, singers, musicians, gatekeepers, people, and they had all come together to honor and dedicate this back to God. It was a little bit of everything. You ever had a party and it's just like, man, we got to plan this just right? Well, the leaders of this did. There was so much joy and things going on there. If I looked through the chapter and I was trying to match these things up, but if you look in chapter 12 especially, it mentions singing 8 times or something about singing. We sing to celebrate things along the way in life. It mentioned Thanksgiving at least 6 times. They came together because they were thankful in part of that. The word root is of rejoicing or being joyful was given 7 times in there. And musical instruments were mentioned 3 times. And I thought, I'm thinking, did they have the issues that the church for centuries has had? When they're talking in chapter 12 about the ones that were coming and playing instruments, I'm thinking, man, I like the trumpet section, but get those lyres out of there. And the other ones that like the harp music were going, man, they can't hear us if the trumpets are playing. And I thought, guess what? But they all what? They came together. And it says they had singers. In fact, they paid their singers. They had different ones as part of all this that were there to help celebrate and come together. And I want you to open your Bibles because I want you to sort of see some of what they did as they came together. In chapter 12, we're just going to sort of scan some of these verses. I want to read some of them with you. In chapter 12, in verse 27 and 28, it says in Nehemiah, at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, the Levites were sought out from where they lived and were brought to Jerusalem to celebrate joyfully the dedications with songs of thanksgiving and with music of cymbals, harps, and lyres. Oh, I forgot the cymbals. Now, nowadays, we have in different churches drum sets up there, and I hear people going, the drums were too loud. And I'm thinking, guess what? In the Old Testament, I'm going, guess what? They probably had some of the same thoughts, didn't they? And so it says, and the musicians also were brought together from the regions around Jerusalem. And it names all of these different spots. In verse 31, Nehemiah writes, I had the leaders of Judah go up to the top of the wall. And I also assigned 2 large choirs to give thanks. Here's where you come in. I need a couple able-bodied people to stand up. Yeah. Huh? There's one. All right. Allie, come out this way. Stop right in the middle in the back. Need somebody to represent this side over here. There's. All right. Rob's going to be brave. Rob, go back there and be brave with Allie. Because you have to go back there, though. I was going to say, you might have to circle the other way, but however you get there. And it says to these ones, it says, I had the leaders of Judah go to the top of the wall, and I also assigned 2 large choirs to give thanks. You guys are helping them. They are the leaders. And it says, and one was to proceed on the top of the wall to the right, toward the dung gate. Who wants to go towards the dung gate? Allie says, I'll do it. All right. And then down in verse 38, it also says in here, and the second choir proceeded in the opposite direction. And he says, I followed them to the top of the wall with half the people, past the tower of the ovens to the broad wall over to the gate of Ephraim. Okay, I want you to join me a cappella singing This Is the Day, because we're going to celebrate. You guys walk behind the back pews on each side and pretend like you actually have people following you instead of just sitting. And we're going to sing This Is the Day, and then I want you to circle, come around and come up here on stage. This is the day that the Lord hath made, We will rejoice, We will rejoice and be glad in it, and be in it. This is the day that the Lord hath made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. This is the day that the Lord hath made. And both leaders of both choirs came together, and it says they assembled then in the temple, and the people were there to celebrate with joy. Thank you for doing that. I was going to say, it's hard to get volunteers to... But I want you to think it wasn't just a 30-second song. It was that they each started out and they walked around the wall on the top with the choirs, with the ones following them. What did that tell you about their accomplishment? Remember their enemies in the past said, oh, how can they build the wall back when all is rubble? It was a sign that what they had done was strong and sturdy, because they didn't just walk down at the base and hope that everything stayed in place. They walked across the top of them, around, and came together again. Look back in verse 36 and 37 of this chapter. It tells us, it says in verse 36, with musical instrument prescribed by David, the man of God, Ezra, the teacher of the law, led the procession. And at the fountain gate, they continued directly up to the steps of the city of David on the ascent to the wall, and past the side of David's palace to the water gate on the east. Each one of them had a direction to go. In verse 40 through 43, and the two choirs gave thanks, that then took their places in the house of God, and so took I, he writes, together with half the officials as well as the priests. And all of these had come together to celebrate. And it says, on that day they offered, in verse 43, great sacrifices, rejoicing because God had given them, my translation says, great joy. They had something to celebrate. They had done something. They had been under pressure. They had been under opposition. And each of them had contributed. And each of them was a part of it. And they came together. And it says, the women and children also rejoiced. And the sounds of rejoicing in Jerusalem could be heard far away. How many of you rejoiced this last week at the NCAA men's basketball tournament? There was a few. But there were some that it was like, oh. And you're going, well, but guess what? We cheered hard no matter what for the teams we're rooting for. But the ones that cheered loudly, it was like, it was amazing. There was a shot, a last-minute shot we saw in one of the games where the guy at half court just does one of these, and he throws it up, and it goes in, and they win the game. And it's like the place went wild. Thinking, how about God's people? We go out to football games, and we go out to basketball games, and we do all these celebrating, and yet we sometimes come together and we're going, praise God from whom all blessings flow. And Nehemiah and the people of God were there, and it tells us in this passage, when they had come together, it says they could be what? Heard where? Far away. Have you ever thought what it would be like if somebody came into town here and they were calling City Hall and say, would you go over and quiet those Christian people down? They've been partying way too much. They've been making a lot of noise and disturbing us. We don't know what it is, but they're just seeming like they're having too much fun. And Nehemiah and Ezra and these ones that had come together, they were celebrating what God had done for them. They had been called by God. They came together to serve under God. And they took and they accomplished what needed to be done. So often we forget that even small accomplishments for God are a cause for celebration. You think, guess what? They were still having others in control over them, even though they were coming back in Jerusalem. There were still foreign kings in charge over them. But they were coming back and they were honoring God, and God was blessing them for what they were doing. In one way, you can look at this and say, what did they have to do first? Well, they first had to take and give themselves to the Lord. They had to trust Him. They had to give themselves fully to the God, that what He said would be all right. It would be enough. It would get them where they needed to be. And then they needed to give their songs of praise back to God. Guess what? People have been writing songs for years. Each generation. Some of the Psalms in the Old Testament were written for worship in Jerusalem, in the temple, and the ascent going to the temple as people were walking up. Have you ever thought about people singing as they come into church? Wouldn't that catch people's attention if people were out on a sunny day? And so not only giving ourselves, giving our songs to worship, but the last part of this that I started with for our offering meditation was that they gave their substance back to God. They literally gave back to God so that there would be blessing for those that would be serving in God's kingdom in specific ways along of that. What brings you joy? What brings you hope? For us, it comes of the promise of God through Jesus Christ. These people back in Nehemiah's day were looking for the promised hope. We get to celebrate what they were looking for because Jesus has come. This week is called Holy Week. It gives us a chance to take and honor and worship God and think about where God has taken us through some of the cycles, through that cycle of sorrow. I don't know any of us that have not had those moments of sorrow of some type in our life. But God is still faithful, and He takes us from that and He brings us back to joy. There's probably going to be some sorrow still in our life, but we can have joy in the Lord. And we come together and we do that because we have a powerful God who is greater than anything else that we can ever think of. And that God in Nehemiah's day and Ezra's day and Zerubbabel's day is still the same God today. He is powerful. He is mighty. I want us to sing a chorus that we've sung many times through the years. We're going to sing it that says, "Great and mighty is the Lord our God." Because we need to remind ourselves that God is still great. God is still mighty. He will take us where we need to be.